Berlin, early July 1945. A Hollywood director named George Stevens, now serving as a U.S. Army captain, ventured with his camera crew into the shattered heart of Hitler's former empire. At the Brandenburg Gate, a place that had once echoed with the thunder of victory parades, there was only a stunned, surreal silence. At Pariser Platz, the men filmed the gutted, skeletal remains of the once fashionable Hotel Adlon, a military hospital during the final battle, now a burnt-out shell. Just around the corner, along the famed boulevard of Unter den Linden, was a landscape of collapsing ruins. For 2 months, since the end of the war, the Soviet authorities had ruled this city. Now, the British and Americans were finally allowed to move into their agreed-upon sectors. Stevens, a man used to the dream factory of Hollywood, had special permission to document the lives of the defeated after 12 years of Nazi rule and 6 years of war. What he captured was not a city, but a ghost, the apocalyptic aftermath of a regime that had promised a 1,000-year Reich and had delivered only total ruin. This is the story of Berlin in the summer of 1945, the story of Year Zero. This is a story of immense historical weight, a glimpse into a world utterly destroyed. If you believe these pivotal, often overlooked moments of history deserve to be told, make sure to subscribe to the War Archives and hit the like button to support our mission. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's open the archives. As Stevens' cameras rolled, they captured a city stirring with a strange, spectral life. Berlin's former boulevards were now passable again. Bicycles, now a luxury, navigated through the canyons of rubble. Everywhere, the city was being tidied up, the debris of war being moved and sorted. The last weeks of the fighting, the relentless bombing raids, and the terrifying excesses of the Soviet conquerors seemed almost forgotten in the daily, desperate struggle for survival. In a little over a week, the leaders of the victorious powers would meet in nearby Potsdam to decide the future of the city, and of Germany itself. But while the future was being debated, a different kind of ceremony was taking place in Moscow. On the 24th of June, 1945, 6 weeks after the German surrender, the Soviet Union celebrated its victory over the fascist beast. Here, before the ancient walls of the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin, the Generalissimo, stood atop Lenin's mausoleum to receive the homage of his subjects and oversee the Red Army's grand parade. For 4 years, he had demanded everything of his people to drive the German invaders out of their country. The cost had been staggering: 27 million Soviet casualties in the Great Patriotic War. Now, the Red Army celebrated itself and its victory. In a moment of supreme, camera-ready symbolism, captured standards of the defeated Wehrmacht and SS were thrown down onto the wet cobblestones at the foot of the mausoleum. Stalin was at the absolute height of his power. Back in Berlin, a flight over the city revealed a desert of rubble. 50,000 tons of explosives had fallen on the German capital during the war. Of its buildings, 48,000 were completely destroyed, 23,000 severely damaged. After visiting the destroyed capital, the British Air Force Marshal, Arthur Tedder, was utterly stunned. Berlin as a city is completely destroyed. The ruins of what was once Berlin should be preserved as a modern Babylon or Carthage. The city is completely dead. You drive kilometer after kilometer through abandoned ruins and find nothing habitable. Berlin can never be rebuilt. The New York Times hoped that the obliteration of Berlin could herald the beginning of a renewed German civilization. But the American journalist William Shirer, returning to the city he had known before the war, captured the profound sense of dislocation in his diary. How shall one find words to portray truthfully and accurately the picture of a great capital destroyed beyond recognition? The image of a once powerful nation that has ceased to exist. The image of a conquering people who only 5 years ago behaved in such a brutally arrogant manner and were blindly convinced of their mission as a master race. Yet, in this pile of rubble, there were still Berliners filled with a desperate, almost manic confidence. The journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich wrote in her diary on July 7, "The whole city lives in a frenzy of expectation. One wants to tear oneself apart with eagerness to work. The Americans are here. The English, the Russians, the French, too. All that matters is that we are at the center of the activity." 2.8 million people still lived in Berlin. The cityscape was dominated by the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. With most of the men killed or imprisoned, it fell to them to begin the colossal task of reconstruction, taking stone after stone, brick by brick, from the mountains of rubble in a cleanup effort that would take years. At the same time, cameramen from the American Special Film Project 186 were also on the move. On July 9, Captain Carter shot footage of Berlin women and children who were, at least in the Allied sectors, being adequately cared for. Refugees from the East, however, had a particularly hard time. The journalist William Shire described them as starving human beings with no will, purpose in life or goal, reduced to animalistic functions like finding food and shelter. Rations were meager, divided into a complex category system. The best off were heavy laborers. Then came blue and white-collar workers, the rubble women, and children. Those who did not work received only ration card number 5, a ticket for the rest of the population that was known in the vernacular as the cemetery card. Captain Carter's real job was to document the bomb damage in the capital, but he was particularly interested in the historic buildings that had played a special role in the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. The Kaiserhof Hotel, once the first luxury hotel in Imperial Berlin, was now a ruin. From 1932, Hitler had lived exclusively in this hotel when visiting the city, and from his suite, he had planned his takeover of Germany. It was just as much a ruin as the Berlin Sportpalast, the great arena where, in 1943, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had famously shrieked to a fanatical crowd, "Do you want total war?" It took only 2 years for that total war to finally reach Berlin and consume the building itself. Hitler's own Reich Chancellery was also badly damaged. On May 1, Goebbels had committed suicide here with his family, clearing the way for the city's surrender. Now, Red Army soldiers had immortalized themselves on the building signs with vulgar slogans. On this 9th of July, 1945, the ultimate fate of Adolf Hitler himself remained unclear to the public. German propaganda had declared that the Führer was killed in action, fighting to his last breath. But this was a lie. In the bunker under the garden of the Reich Chancellery, the dictator had shot himself in the head on April 30th. His last loyal followers had carried the body to a bunker exit, doused it with petrol, and set it ablaze. Former security officers would soon testify that they had watched the burning from a watchtower, and that the charred remains of Hitler and his wife Eva were then buried in a nearby bomb crater. But what had happened to the bodies? As early as May 5, Soviet Secret Service agents had found the grave and, within a short time, had identified Hitler by his dental records. Joseph Stalin was immediately informed, but the Kremlin ruler kept the news a closely guarded secret, hoping to keep his Western allies in the dark and sow confusion. Another U.S. Air Force cameraman meticulously documented the bullet holes in the monumental architecture of the Reich Chancellery, a building that for 6 years had symbolized a delusion of invincibility. Now, the Red Army had put a bloody end to that hubris. Throughout conquered Berlin, the Soviet victors put up posters with mottos by Joseph Stalin, proclaiming that the Red Army harbored no racial hatred against the German people. Such words were sheer, bitter mockery for the countless Berliners who had endured looting and mass rapes in the first weeks after the surrender. The journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich wrote in her diary, "How little do trained politicians understand the simple trick that you only win peoples if you offer them better than before. The inhabitants of the East Zone hate the Russians today. The Americans will do it differently." A symbol of hope was the almost intact Victory Column, affectionately called the Gold Else by Berliners, which now stood in the British sector of the city. Hollywood director George Stevens also took his camera crew to the Reich Chancellery, a place where Germans had once cheered their Führer. Now, most of them didn't want to hear about it anymore. Stevens had special permission from the Soviet authorities to film inside the building. In the Grand Cour d'honneur, where state guests were once received, Albert Speer had gone all out for crude, intimidating effects. "When the diplomats see this, they will learn to fear it," Hitler was said to have once told his architect. But the Hollywood director was also interested in the dictator's final whereabouts. That the body was burned in the garden was, at this point, still only a rumor. What was certain was that Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda had taken their own lives here after murdering their 6 children, their charred bodies also recovered by the Soviets. George Stevens and his team drove to the sites from Germany's imperial past. At the National Monument to Kaiser Wilhelm I, the American reporters met a group of Red Army soldiers. The Soviets were already consolidating their power, installing German communists who had been flown in from Moscow into key positions. But directly at the Brandenburg Gate was the largest black market in occupied Berlin, a place where the emerging Cold War seemed distant. Here, desperate Berliners sold their last belongings for food. Officially, the Allied authorities disapproved of the barter trade and occasionally cracked down on it, but it was a necessary part of survival. Most Berliners were not interested in the slowly emerging conflict between the victorious powers, but in the daily struggle to live. On July 10, Captain Carter filmed the rubble women, clearing mountains of debris for 72 pfennigs an hour and a better ration card. Every usable brick would be the basis for new housing. On this same day, Ruth Andreas Friedrich reflected in her diary on the political future of Germany, wondering what had remained of the nation's best and brightest after years of war and tyranny. Cameraman Carter's notes captured a small, heartbreaking detail: a 9-year-old boy, his parents dead, searching the ruins for his older brother. Endless refugee tracks passed through the ruined city. Water was a precious commodity, still provided by public pumps, but much of the groundwater was contaminated, carrying the risk of dysentery or typhus. Those who still had homes had to improvise. If a facade was missing, family life took place in full view of the public. At night, people had to be careful not to fall into bomb craters in the dark. Although most of the streets had been cleared, there was almost no traffic in the former metropolis. Most cars had been confiscated, first by the Wehrmacht, and later by the victors. And so, people waited patiently for the few means of public transport that were running again. George Stevens had also gone to the Reich Sportfeld, where Nazi Germany had hosted the 1936 Summer Olympics. At first, the USA had wanted to boycott the event, but had relented when the regime agreed to allow Jewish athletes to compete. The black American athlete Jesse Owens, with his 4 gold medals, had become the superstar of the Games, much to the chagrin of the Führer. Now, the site was in the British sector, and the new masters had immediately put the Olympic swimming stadium back into operation for their own soldiers. For Germans, of course, swimming was off-limits. Stevens and his team also took a trip to the Wannsee Lake, where a few bathers were enjoying the summer sun. They were occupation soldiers and their female German companions, demonstratively ignoring the official ban on fraternization. The interest in the German Fräuleins seemed to unite the soldiers of the victorious powers. On July 12, soldiers of the British Desert Rats, the famed 7th Armored Division, marched across Hitler's east-west axis to the Brandenburg Gate for a victory parade. The border between the British and Soviet sectors ran right here, the ideal place to celebrate the joint victory. But Berliners could already sense that cracks were appearing in the Allied brotherhood in arms. Ruth Andreas Friedrich wrote in her diary, "They don't seem to love each other, our Allied occupying forces." Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the commander of the British forces, had arrived to present the victor of Berlin, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, with a high British Order of Merit. Joint appearances like this were intended to deceive the public about the true, deteriorating state of relations between the Allies. Hollywood director George Stevens had also come to Berlin to document the forthcoming conference of the victors. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin had last met at Yalta. Now, with Roosevelt dead, the new American president, Harry S. Truman, would be his successor. The Big Three were meeting in the nearby city of Potsdam to discuss the future of Germany. In the British sector, Stevens filmed a Red Army unit marching through the Tiergarten. His own president, Truman, was expressing the belief that the Russians would continue to be friends of the U.S. On July 14, Captain Carter filmed at Pariser Platz, now part of the Soviet sector. What would be the future of this destroyed, defeated, and occupied nation? Would the Soviet Union extend its influence further west? Was Stalin counting on the withdrawal of American troops, as Roosevelt had once hinted? Or would the Western Allies stick to their plan to rebuild the country and educate the Germans to become Democrats? U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had won Truman over to the view that the only hope for a stable future in Europe was an economically strong and productive Germany. In his diary, he wrote about a conversation with Truman: "Punish the war criminals severely, but don't deprive them of the possibility of building a contented Germany at the end." This is exactly what Ruth Andreas Friedrich hoped for, writing, "Never before have we been so ripe for redemption, so tired of terror, fear, and injustice. If only our victors will keep their promises to us." On the afternoon of July 15, three C-54 transport planes landed at the British military airfield in Gatto. On board was the American delegation for the Potsdam Conference. The notorious prosecutor of the Stalinist show trials, Andrei Vyshinsky, greeted the U.S. Secretary of State. President Truman also left his plane. In a letter to his mother before leaving Washington, he had written, "I have a briefcase full of information. I wish I didn't have to go there." Potsdam had been sealed off by Soviet checkpoints for days. In front of a villa nicknamed the Little White House, Truman received the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. These scenes were filmed by Kirk B. Lorton, a member of the American delegation. Churchill was a head of government on call. He had just lost the general election, and the results were not yet known. He believed Truman could not hold a candle to his late predecessor, but was impressed by the new president's resolve. Truman was less enthusiastic. As his diary revealed, "He gave me a lot of hooey about how great my country is and how much he loved Roosevelt. I am sure we can get along if he doesn't give me too much soft soap." The conference was to take place in the Sicilienhof Palace, the former residence of the German Crown Prince. Lorton was allowed to film from the gallery. A Russian camera crew, on the other hand, shot in 35mm color. On the first day of the conference, Truman was in high spirits. He had just received a coded message. On a military base in the New Mexico desert, the first nuclear weapons test in history had succeeded. A new era had begun, one that would soon be called the Cold War. The victors agreed that Germany would not be partitioned. They agreed on new borders, on reparations, and that war criminals were to be tried by an international tribunal. The final communiqué sounded hopeful, a promise of a just and lasting peace. But the American president was not so confident. At the sight of the destruction in Berlin, Truman was utterly shocked. On July 16, he wrote in his diary, "I thought of Carthage, Baalbek, Jerusalem, Rome, Atlantis. I hope for some kind of peace, but I fear that machines are several centuries ahead of morality. Only when morality has caught up will there be no more need for such destruction."